And welcome back to this segment of GCSAA TV Live from the 2019 Golf Industry Show here in San Diego, California. GCSAA TV Live is brought to you in partnership with LebanonTurf. My name is Chris Gray, and I'll be your host for this segment. Joining me on stage is Dr. Matt Elmore, professor of weed science in Rutgers University. He's here today to talk about the growing threat of goosegrass in cool season turf. Matt, thanks for taking some time out of your schedule today to join me on stage to talk about this, because I think this is a topic that kind of needs to have a little bit more light shed upon what it is. Because, I mean, for our brethren down south, goosegrass is a constant problem. I mean, even in the transition zone, I talked to a lot of my superintendent friends, and they've been dealing with it. But now, it seems that it's been going farther and farther north. I mean, you're in Rutgers, you're seeing it up there. We're seeing it, I think as we were talking backstage, we're seeing it in Michigan now. We're seeing it in Connecticut now. I mean, why is this starting to happen so much, a lot farther north than it ever has been?
Yeah, we don't, I guess the true answer is we don't really know, but there's a number of factors that could play a role. I mean, part of it could be that herbicide use patterns have been changing in the southern United States, and so that goosegrass has become a little bit more prevalent down there, and has finally made its way up to the north. The other thing is potentially this goosegrass has sort of adapted to the traditional pre-emergence herbicide and post-emergence herbicide programs that are used in cool season turf, and it's found a way around that essentially and become more problematic. The other thing is we're having a lot of warmer summers, sometimes conditions that are conducive for goosegrass. You know, for example, this year it was extremely wet. We had a lot of turf loss right in the middle of the summer, and that's a really good time for goosegrass to come and fill in a lot of those voids that maybe where we lost some turf grass. So it's likely, you know, again, a number of factors, and I don't know if we'll ever truly know the real answer, but yeah, it's definitely becoming much more of a problem. When I got to New Jersey, it was emphasized to me that this is a new weed problem for us, and it's again becoming one of our number one weed issues in the state. So
well, and that's saying a lot too. I mean, because we're obviously, I'm from Pennsylvania, so we have a lot of the same weeds that we're dealing with on there, and where you got crabgrass and you've got, but goosegrass. I mean, while there's always been some presence there, it just seems like over the past probably 5 to 10 years, we've seen just an exponential growth in what those are. I mean, other than the conditions what you just outlined, where it's wet, where it's hot, where the conditions are a lot more amicable for it developing. I mean, is this part of what the natural plant progression is, that it just continues to migrate that direction? Or kind of, it just seems like it's very odd that it's going as far north as what it is now.
Yeah, and I think it's an opportunistic plant. So, you know, once it kind of established itself in one area, you know, there's a lot of, you know, golfers moving from one golf course to another, equipment moving around and things like that, and so the seed can move from one course to another and really get a foothold. And the other thing about goosegrass is it's very adaptable. So we'll even see different biotypes at different mowing heights, which is not a trait found as much in other weeds like crabgrass. So it has this interesting ability to definitely adapt to different management practices and likely different climates and whatnot. So, I mean, and you know, I don't think, I think it really has to do with the intensity of the summer as to where you're going to see it. So as those summers become more intense, potentially farther northward, you know, it's going to be opportunistic in the summertime, and regardless of how cold the winter is, those seed are going to survive the winter no matter what. So once it gets a foothold, and it has those opportunities in the summertime to fill voids in compacted areas and wet areas and that kind of thing, then it's going to be here to stay. So.
Yeah, so you said when you got to New Jersey that this has been identified as a weed that's becoming much more problematic. And exactly, in terms of how would you describe how bad of a problem it's becoming in these type of environments with cool season turf that traditionally it's not been something that's been on the top priority list? I mean, we always have crabgrass. We always have ones that we're used to dealing with, but now we're dealing with a type of a weed that, while very prevalent down in the south, now we got to start paying more attention to it. I mean, how bad could you describe as what this is now and what potentially really can be?
Sure. I mean, on courses where it's really taken a foothold, we will see it completely dominate golf course fairways by June or July. And so the problem is you'll get courses that have had populations kind of develop there over the years, where by the end of the summer, 50 to 60% of that fairway is covered in goosegrass. And that becomes a problem then, because once those plants die off in the fall at the first frost, then you've got these voids that have been created and you're in a kind of a recovery, sort of a defensive type scenario. And then on putting greens, it can become a huge problem as well, and that's one of the implications of having it become more of a problem in fairways and in surrounds, and then it'll move into the putting green where your options for control are extremely limited, and that's when it really becomes a problem, is once it gets to the putting surface. And so much as if you were to not control crabgrass on a golf course, and it would dominate that golf course in the fairways and roughs over the years, we have tools to control crabgrass, so it's not as much of a problem, but goosegrass can dominate the turf stand much like crabgrass can.
So as you mentioned crabgrass, that's one that obviously is very well known, how to control it in cool season turf, established there's no real questions about how to deal with that.
Sure.
When you're talking more about goosegrass, how similar is it to crabgrass as far as the timing of it, as far as what the possible treatments can be for prevention and post? How similar are those two when you're looking at it from like your weed science standpoint?
Sure. So the weeds have a very similar life cycle. The goosegrass will germinate later than crabgrass, and one of the things we're trying to do right now is to understand a little bit more about when goosegrass germinates. But it's going to germinate in the summertime, it's going to grow rapidly through the summer, it's going to die in the fall, just like crabgrass. But the problem is that while they're both warm season annual grassy weeds, the options for control and some of the cultural practices too that you can use to control them are going to be a little bit different. And so if you've been approaching your weed control program from the mindset of crabgrass control, those strategies that you use for crabgrass control are not necessarily going to work against goosegrass. And so that is possibly also one of the reasons we're seeing it become more of a problem. So you need to select different herbicides and do different things to control goosegrass.
So how would you compare the two? If I've got, we know we're going to get crabgrass, and you now suspect after a number of years that goosegrass is going to be a problem too. How does a program, as far as pre-emergently dealing with this, how are the programs similar? How are they different? Is there an efficacy difference? What kind of, how does all that play together when you're trying to control on one piece of property with two weeds like this?
Yeah, so you'll need to adapt your pre-emergence program a little bit. I mean, if we're talking about these crabgrass and goosegrass as annual weeds, a good pre-emergence program is always going to be a lot more effective and economical than trying to rely on post-emergence herbicides. So one of the things you can do is to split your applications of a pre-emergence herbicide. So you make one application for crabgrass and then another application 6 to 8 weeks later to extend the residual of those pre-emergence herbicides so that you'll pick up goosegrass whenever it's emerging. The other interesting thing, though, is a lot of the common crabgrass pre-emergence herbicides that are used in cool season turf are actually less effective against goosegrass, even if you're going to compare similar rates. If the weeds were to germinate at the same time, goosegrass requires either a higher rate of certain pre-emergence herbicides like dithiopyr and prodiamine, or a different herbicide such as oxidizon, which is Ronstar, which is going to be more effective on goosegrass than it will on crabgrass. And the prodiamine and the dithiopyr, barricade, to mention a lot of the standard pre-emergence herbicides that work excellent on crabgrass are going to be less effective on the goosegrass, even at higher rates.
No, I think I see where it's going to be a challenge to try to balance those two together. And as goosegrass continues to become more prevalent and have to deal with those, the same old approaches you've done in the past with crabs is not going to work as for the same. Now, pre-emergently, obviously, as you mentioned, dealing with them before they come up is obviously a lot better. I know when I was a superintendent, I used to get goosegrass on like bunker faces, on areas that where the pre-emergent treatment wasn't as effective. So what can be done if the superintendents miss the window, or what do we have available to us post-emergently that could be used in cool season turf with that may not be as damaging? Sure,
there are a couple of different options. One of the main options that you think of for crabgrass control, which is quinclorac or Drive, and it's mixed into a lot of other products, is completely ineffective against goosegrass. And so that's one of the things that we have to talk about and to educate more on is, one, you need to understand the weed that you're targeting. So there are two, crabgrass and goosegrass are summer annual grassy weeds, but
But one product that's extremely effective on crabgrass and drive or quinclorac is, again, not going to work on goosegrass. But there are two main active ingredients that are going to provide post-emergence goosegrass control. One is phenoxyprop, which is a claim extra, and that's safe in most of your cool season turf grasses, with the exception of bent grass. You can use very low rates in bent grass. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the other option is Pilex, and Pilex is an extremely effective compound. That's dipramazone, the active ingredient there, and it's extremely effective against a pretty wide range of stages of goosegrass. So whether they're small plants or large plants, that Pilex is an extremely effective herbicide. If we're in Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, fine fescues, it gets a little bit different in bent grass, where again you have to use lower rates of both Acclaim and Pilex. And the problem with using lower rates is you will either need multiple applications, or you'll need to be scouting plants and targeting them when they're much smaller in size to obtain control with those products. And then we've also looked at another product which you typically think of for broadleaf weed control in Speed Zone. We've actually found some goosegrass control with that product as well. And if the plants, even on larger plants, we've found that product to be effective, and we're looking at combinations of Speed Zone and Pilex and other things as well, because one of the things that's going to be important is that we need to steward the herbicides that we have. Right now we don't have very many options for post-emergence goosegrass control. There's basically 2 or 3 modes of action. And if we rely, say, on Pilex, for example, to control these escapes on bunker faces for year after year after year, we've seen in the southern United States that goosegrass is going to adapt and will develop mechanisms of resistance to Pilex, and so then that would be, you'd be out of options there. So it's important to rotate and to use multiple modes of action. But yeah, in short, Acclaim, Pilex, and Speed Zone are good options, and it's important to know the tolerance of your turf grass to these different herbicides and read the label, and especially for Acclaim, to understand the size of the plants that you're targeting, and to go after as soon as you can to see those plants and make a post-emergence herbicide application, because if you wait until August and that plant has 10 or 15 tillers, it's going to be much more difficult to control. So,
how bad is the resistance issue you were just talking about? I mean, is that something obviously that you want to be very mindful of? I mean, with limited amount of technologies to deal with that, is that the biggest threat with that?
I think it's a threat for sure, and one of the things we've observed from turf grass managers in the southern United States is that goosegrass is a weed that seems to be able to adapt to herbicide chemistries a little bit more than, say, crabgrass. So it has this ability to adapt, and it's one of those things that's definitely important. I think it's something we're working on right now, especially on the pre-emergence side, to understand whether or not there is resistance to some of the traditional pre-emergence we've been using in the Northeast, and whether that's contributing to this emergence, I guess you could say, of goosegrass in the region. So we're trying to understand it more right now from a pre-emergence perspective, but history will, I think, repeat itself from the post-emergence side if we're not a little bit mindful about some of the different options and trying to use different options from year to year.
Okay.
So,
well, how about from the standpoint, because we're getting close on time, tell me about what advice you would have for superintendents that are just now experiencing a big uptick in this. Well, what can you, from your standpoint, offer them as advice for starting to help control this?
Specifically in cool season turf grass, I would start to look at Ronstar or oxidizon as a component of my pre-emergence herbicide program. Now, you're not going to want to abandon your traditional prodiamine, barricade, or dithiopyr dimension programs, because those are going to be important for crabgrass control, but this oxidizon is something that I would make an application of oxidizon, granular oxidizon to dry turf grass in some of these problem areas, make that application in, say, early to mid-May, and see if that helps to improve some of those really problematic areas. And then in the other areas, really start to scout and be aware of when those plants emerge so you can make those post-emergence applications when the plants are small, and start to develop a herbicide program and plan in advance. I think it's important to plan in advance if you've had this issue in the past, so that you're not being reactive.
And if you can plan, you can reduce herbicide rates.
Absolutely.
More economical programs, and you're not going to be chasing from behind in middle of August.
Well, it's all about planning, isn't it?
That's
well,
right.
That's fantastic. Listen, that's all about the time that we have for this segment of GCSA TV Live. I'd like to thank Dr. Elmore, the professor of weed science at Rutgers University, for a time up here on stage.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in for this segment, brought to you by in partnership with LebanonTurf. We'll see you on the next segment where we'll be talking about environmental issues facing today's superintendent. Thank you.